Jamie looked down at his son, peacefully asleep in Margaret's arms. "I'm offering you marriage." They were married 3 days later in a brief, private ceremony. The only witness was David Blackwell. During the wedding ceremony, Jamie McGregor was filled with mixed emotions. He was a man who had grown used to controlling and manipulating others, and this time it was he who had been manipulated. He glanced at Margaret. Standing next to him, she looked almost beautiful. He remembered her passion and abandon, but it was only a memory, nothing more, without heat or emotion. He had used Margaret as an instrument of vengeance, and she had produced his heir. The minister was saying, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Jamie leaned forward and briefly touched his lips to Margaret's cheek. "Let's go home," Jamie said. His son was waiting for him. When they returned to the house, Jamie showed Margaret to a bedroom in one of the wings. "This is your bedroom," Jamie informed her. "I see. I'll hire another housekeeper and put Mrs. Talley in charge of Jamie. If there's anything you require, tell David Blackwell." Margaret felt as though he had struck her. He was treating her like a servant. But that was not important. "My son has a name. That is enough for me." Jamie did not return home for dinner. Margaret waited for him, then finally dined alone. That night she lay awake in her bed, aware of every sound in the house. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she finally fell asleep. Her last thought was to wonder which of the women at Madame Agnes's he had chosen. If Margaret's relationship with Jamie was unchanged since their marriage, her relationship with the townspeople of Klipdrift underwent a miraculous transformation. Overnight, Margaret went from being an outcast to becoming Klipdrift's social arbiter. Most of the people in town depended for their living in one way or another on Jamie McGregor and Kruger Brent, Limited. They decided that if Margaret van der Merwe was good enough for Jamie McGregor, she was good enough for them. Now when Margaret took little Jamie for an outing, she was met with smiles and cheery greetings. Invitations poured in. She was invited to teas, charity luncheons and dinners and urged to head civic committees. When she dressed her hair in a different way, dozens of women in town instantly followed suit. She bought a new yellow dress, and yellow dresses were suddenly popular. Margaret handled their fawning in the same manner she had handled their hostility, with quiet dignity. Jamie came home only to spend time with his son. His attitude toward Margaret remained distant and polite. Each morning at breakfast she played the role of happy wife for the servants' benefit, despite the cool indifference of the man sitting across the table from her. But when Jamie had gone and she could escape to her room, she would be drenched in perspiration. She hated herself. Where was her pride? Because Margaret knew she still loved Jamie. "I'll always love him," she thought. "God help me." Jamie was in Cape Town on a 3-day business trip. As he came out of the Royal Hotel, a liveried black driver said, "Carriage, sir?" "No," Jamie said. "I'll walk." "Banda thought you might like to ride." Jamie stopped and looked sharply at the man. "Banda?" "Yes, Mr. McGregor." Jamie got into the carriage. The driver flicked his whip and they started off. Jamie sat back in his seat, thinking of Banda, his courage, his friendship. He had tried many times to find him in the last 2 years, with no success. Now he was on his way to meet his friend. The driver turned the carriage toward the waterfront, and Jamie knew instantly where they were going. 15 minutes later the carriage stopped in front of the deserted warehouse where Jamie and Banda had once planned their adventure into the Namib. What reckless young fools we were, Jamie thought. He stepped out of the carriage and approached the warehouse. Banda was waiting for him. He looked exactly the same, except that now he was neatly dressed in a suit and shirt and tie. They stood there, silently grinning at each other, then they embraced. "You look prosperous," Jamie smiled. Banda nodded. "I've not done badly. I bought that farm we talked about. I have a wife and 2 sons, and I raise wheat and ostriches." "Ostriches. Their feathers bring in lots of money." "Ah, I want to meet your family, Banda." Jamie thought of his own family in Scotland, and of how much he missed them. He had been away from home for 4 years. "I've been trying to find you." "I've been busy, Jamie." Banda moved closer. "I had to see you to give you a warning. There's going to be trouble for you." Jamie studied him. "What kind of trouble?" "The man in charge of the Namib field, Hans Zimmerman, he's bad. The workers hate him. They're talking about walking out." If they do, your guards will try to stop them and there will be a riot. Jamie never took his eyes from Banda's face. Do you remember I once mentioned a man to you, John Tengo Javabu? Yes. He's a political leader. I've been reading about him. He's been stirring up a thunderstorm. I'm one of his followers. Jamie nodded. I see. I'll do what has to be done, Jamie promised. Good. You've become a powerful man, Jamie. I'm glad. Thank you, Banda. And you have a fine-looking son. Jamie could not conceal his surprise. How do you know that? I like to keep track of my friends. Banda rose to his feet. I have a meeting to go to, Jamie. I'll tell them things will be straightened out at the Namab. Yes, I'll attend to it. He followed the large black man to the door. When will I see you again? Banda smiled. I'll be around. You can't get rid of me that easily. And Banda was gone. When Jamie returned to Clipdrift, he sent for young David Blackwell. Has there been any trouble at the Namab field, David? No, Mr. McGregor. He hesitated. But I have heard rumors that there might be. The supervisor there is Hans Zimmerman. Find out if he's mistreating the workers. If he is, put a stop to it. I want you to go up there yourself. I'll leave in the morning. When David arrived at the diamond field at the Namab, he spent 2 hours quietly talking to the guards and the workers. What he heard filled him with a cold fury. When he had learned what he wanted to know, he went to see Hans Zimmerman. Hans Zimmerman was a Goliath of a man. He weighed 300 pounds and was 6 feet, 6 inches tall. He had a sweaty, porcine face and red-veined eyes, and was one of the most unattractive men David Blackwell had ever seen. He was also one of the most efficient supervisors employed by Kruger Brent, Limited. He was seated at a desk in his small office, dwarfing the room, when David walked in. Zimmerman rose and shook David's hand. Pleasure to see you, Mr. Blackwell. You should have told me you was comin'. David was sure that word of his arrival had already reached Zimmerman. Whiskey? No, thank you. Zimmerman leaned back in his chair and grinned. What can I do for you? Ain't we diggin' up enough diamonds to suit the boss? Both men knew that the diamond production at the Namab was excellent. I get more work out of my Kafirs than anyone else in the company, was Zimmerman's boast. We've been getting some complaints about conditions here, David said. The smile faded from Zimmerman's face. What kind of complaints? That the men here are being treated badly in. Zimmerman leapt to his feet, moving with surprising agility. His face was flushed with anger. These ain't men. These are Kafirs. You people sit on your asses at headquarters and listen to me, David said. There's no. You listen to me. I produce more fucking diamonds than anybody else in the company, and you know why. Because I put the fear of God into these bastards. At our other mines, David said, we're paying 59 shillings a month and keep. You're paying your workers only 50 shillings a month. You complainin' 'cause I made a better deal for you. The only thing that counts is profit. Jamie McGregor doesn't agree, David replied. Raise their wages. Zimmerman said sullenly, right. It's the boss's money. I hear there's a lot of whipping going on. Zimmerman snorted. Christ, you can't hurt a native, mister. Their hides are so thick they don't even feel the goddamned whip. It just scares them. Then you've scared 3 workers to death, Mr. Zimmerman. Zimmerman shrugged. There's plenty more where they came from. He's a bloody animal, David thought. And a dangerous one. He looked up at the huge supervisor. If there's any more trouble here, you're going to be replaced. He rose to his feet. You'll start treating your men like human beings. The punishments are to stop immediately. I've inspected their living quarters. Their pigsties. Clean them up. Hans Zimmerman was glaring at him, fighting to control his temper. Anything else? He finally managed to say. Yes, I'll be back here in 3 months. If I don't like what I see, you can find yourself a job with another company. Good day. David turned and walked out. Hans Zimmerman stood there for a long time, filled with a simmering rage. The fools, he thought. Uitlanders. Zimmerman was a Boer, and his father had been a Boer. The land belonged to them and God had put the blacks there to serve them. If God had meant them to be treated like human beings, he would not have made their skins black. Jamie McGregor did not understand that. But what could you expect from an Uitlander, a native lover? Hans Zimmermann knew he would have to be a little more careful in the future. But he would show them who was in charge at the NAMM. Kruger Brent, Limited, was expanding, and Jamie McGregor was away a good deal of the time. He bought a paper mill in Canada. And a shipyard in Australia. When he was home, Jamie spent all his time with his son, who looked more like his father each day. Jamie felt an inordinate pride in the boy. He wanted to take the child with him on his long trips, but Margaret refused to let him. He's much too young to travel. When he's older, he can go with you. If you want to be with him, you'll see him here. Before Jamie had realized it, his son had had his first birthday, and then his second, and Jamie marveled at how the time raced by. It was 1887. To Margaret, the last 2 years had dragged by. Once a week Jamie would invite guests to dinner and Margaret was his gracious hostess. The other men found her witty and intelligent and enjoyed talking to her. She knew that several of the men found her very attractive indeed, but of course they never made an overt move, for she was the wife of Jamie McGregor. When the last of the guests had gone, Margaret would ask, "Did the evening go well for you?" Jamie would invariably answer, "Fine. Good night," and be off to look in on little Jamie. A few minutes later, Margaret would hear the front door close as Jamie left the house. Night after night, Margaret McGregor lay in her bed thinking about her life. She knew how much she was envied by the women in town, and it made her ache, knowing how little there was to envy. She was living out a charade with a husband who treated her worse than a stranger. If only he would notice her. She wondered what he would do if one morning at breakfast she looked up the bowl that contained his oatmeal especially imported from Scotland and poured it over his stupid head. She could visualize the expression on his face, and the fantasy tickled her so much that she began to giggle, and the laughter turned into deep, wrenching sobs. "I don't want to love him anymore. I won't. I'll stop, somehow, before I'm destroyed." By 1890, Klipdrift had more than lived up to Jamie's expectations. In the 7 years he had been there, it had become a full-fledged boomtown, with prospectors pouring in from every part of the world. It was the same old story. They came by coach and in wagons and on foot. They came with nothing but the rags they wore. They needed food and equipment and shelter and grubstake money, and Jamie McGregor was there to supply it all. He had shares in dozens of producing diamond and gold mines, and his name and reputation grew. One morning Jamie received a visit from an attorney for De Beers, the giant conglomerate that controlled the huge diamond mines at Kimberley. "What can I do for you?" Jamie asked. "I've been sent to make you an offer, Mr. McGregor. De Beers would like to buy you out. Name your price." It was a heady moment. Jamie grinned and said, "Name yours." David Blackwell was becoming more and more important to Jamie. In the young American Jamie McGregor saw himself as he once had been. The boy was honest, intelligent and loyal. Jamie made David his secretary, then his personal assistant and, finally, when the boy was 21, his general manager. To David Blackwell, Jamie McGregor was a surrogate father. When David's own father suffered a heart attack, it was Jamie who arranged for a hospital and paid for the doctors, and when David's father died, Jamie McGregor took care of the funeral arrangements. In the 5 years David had worked for Kruger Brent, Limited, he had come to admire Jamie more than any man he had ever known. He was aware of the problem between Jamie and Margaret, and deeply regretted it because he liked them both. "But it's none of my business," David told himself. "My job is to help Jamie in any way I can." Jamie spent more and more time with his son. The boy was 5 now, and the first time Jamie took him down in the mines, young Jamie talked of nothing else for a week. They went on camping trips, and they slept in a tent under the stars. Jamie was used to the skies of Scotland, where the stars knew their rightful places in the firmament. Here in South Africa, the constellations were confusing. In January Canopus shone brilliantly overhead, while in May it was the Southern Cross that was near the zenith. In June, which was South Africa's winter, Scorpio was the glory of the heavens. It was puzzling. Still, it was a very special feeling for Jamie to lie on the warm earth and look up at the timeless sky with his son at his side and know they were part of the same eternity. They rose at dawn and shot game for the pot, partridge, guinea fowl, reedbuck and oribi. Little Jamie had his own pony, and father and son rode along the veldt carefully avoiding the 6-foot holes dug by the ant bear, deep enough to engulf a horse and rider, and the smaller holes dug by the meerkat. There was danger on the veldt. On one trip Jamie and his son were camped at a riverbed where they were almost killed by a band of migrating springbok. The first sign of trouble was a faint cloud of dust on the horizon. Hares and jackals and meerkats raced past and large snakes came out of the brush looking for rocks under which to hide. Jamie looked at the horizon again. The dust cloud was coming closer. "Let's get out of here," he said. "Our tent. Leave it." The two of them quickly mounted and headed for the top of a high hill. They heard the drumming of hooves and then they could see the front rank of the springbok, racing in a line at least 3 miles long. There were more than 500,000 of them, sweeping away everything in their path. Trees were torn down and shrubs were pulverized, and in the wake of the relentless tide were the bodies of hundreds of small animals. Hares, snakes, jackals and guinea fowl were crushed beneath the deadly hooves. The air was filled with dust and thunder, and when it was finally over, Jamie estimated that it had lasted more than 3 hours. On Jamie's 6th birthday, his father said, "I'm going to take you to Cape Town next week and show you what a real city looks like. Can Mother go with us?" Jamie asked. "She doesn't like voodoo, but she likes cities." His father ruffled the boy's hair and said, "She's busy here, son. Just the two of us men, eh?" The child was disturbed by the fact that his mother and father seemed so distant with each other, but then he did not understand it. They made the journey in Jamie's private railway car. By the year 1891, railways were becoming the preeminent means of travel in South Africa, for trains were inexpensive, convenient and fast. The private railway car Jamie ordered built for himself was 71 feet long and had 4 paneled staterooms that could accommodate 12 persons, a salon that could be used as an office, a dining compartment, a barroom and a fully equipped kitchen. The staterooms had brass beds, pinch gas lamps and wide picture windows. "Where are all the passengers?" the young boy asked. Jamie laughed. "We're all the passengers. It's your train, son." Young Jamie spent most of the trip staring out the window, marveling at the endless expanse of land speeding past. "This is God's land," his father told him. "He filled it with precious minerals for us. They're all in the ground, waiting to be discovered. What's been found so far is only the beginning, Jamie." When they arrived at Cape Town, young Jamie was awed by the crowds and the huge buildings. Jamie took his son down to the McGregor shipping line, and pointed out 6 ships loading and unloading in the harbor. "You see those? They belong to us." When they returned to Klipdrift, young Jamie was bursting with the news of all he had seen. "Papa owns the whole city." The boy exclaimed, "You'd love it, Mama. You'll see it next time." Margaret hugged her son to her. "Yes, darling." Jamie spent many nights away from home, and Margaret knew he was at Madame Agnes's. She had heard he had bought a house for one of the women so that he could visit her privately. She had no way of knowing whether it was true. Margaret only knew that whoever she was, she wanted to kill her. To retain her sanity, Margaret forced herself to take an interest in the town. She raised funds to build a new church and started a mission to help the families of prospectors who were in dire need. She demanded that Jamie use one of his railroad cars to transport prospectors free of charge back to Cape Town when they had run out of money and hope. "You're asking me to throw away good money, woman," he growled. "Let 'em walk back the same way they came." "They're in no condition to walk," Margaret argued. "And if they stay, the town will have to bear the cost of clothing and feeding them." "All right," Jamie finally grumbled. "But it's a damn fool idea." "Thank you, Jamie." He watched Margaret march out of his office, and, in spite of himself, he could not help feeling a certain pride in her. She'd make a fine wife for someone, Jamie thought. The name of the woman Jamie set up in a private house was Maggie, the pretty prostitute who had sat next to Margaret at the baby shower. It was ironic, Jamie thought, that she should bear Biff's wife's name. They were nothing alike. This Maggie was a 21-year-old blonde with a pert face and a lush body, a tigress in bed. Jamie had paid Madame Agnes well for letting him take the girl, and he gave Maggie a generous allowance. Jamie was very discreet when he visited the small house. It was almost always at night, and he was certain he was unobserved. In fact, he was observed by many people, but not one of them cared to comment about it. It was Jamie McGregor's town, and he had the right to do anything he pleased. On this particular evening, Jamie was finding no joy. He had gone to the house anticipating pleasure, but Maggie was in a foul mood. She lay sprawled across the large bed, her rose-colored dressing gown not quite concealing her ripe breasts or the silky, golden triangle between her thighs. "I'm sick of stayin' locked up in this damned house," she said. "It's like I'm a slave or somethin'. At least at Madame Agnes's there was somethin' goin' on all the time. Why don't you ever take me with you when you travel?" "I've explained that, Maggie. I can't." She leapt out of bed and stood defiantly before him, her dressing gown wide open. "Horseshit. You take your son everywhere. Ain't I as good as your son?" "No," Jamie said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "You're not." He walked over to the bar and poured himself a brandy. It was his fourth, much more than he usually drank. "I don't mean a damn thing to you," Maggie screamed. "I'm just a piece of ass." She threw her head back and laughed derisively. "Big, moral Scotchman. Scot, not Scotchman. For Christ's sake, will you stop criticizin' me? Everything I do ain't good enough. Who the hell do you think you are, my bloody father?" Jamie had had enough. "You can go back to Madame Agnes's tomorrow. I'll tell her you're coming." He picked up his hat and headed for the door. "You can't get rid of me like this, you bastard." She followed him, wild with anger. Jamie stopped at the door. "I just did." And he disappeared into the night. To his surprise, he found he was walking unsteadily. His mind seemed fuzzy. Perhaps he had had more than 4 brandies. He was not sure. He thought about Maggie's naked body in bed that evening, and how she had flaunted it, teasing him, then withdrawing. She had played with him, stroking him and running her soft tongue over his body until he was hard and eager for her. And then she had begun the fight, leaving him inflamed and unsatisfied. When Jamie reached home, he entered the front hall, and as he started toward his room, he passed the closed door of Margaret's bedroom. There was a light from under the door. She was still awake. Jamie suddenly began to picture Margaret in bed, wearing a thin nightgown. Or perhaps nothing. He remembered how her rich, full body had writhed beneath him under the trees by the Orange River. With the liquor guiding him, he opened Margaret's bedroom door and entered. She was in bed reading by the light of a kerosene lamp. She looked up in surprise. "Jamie, is something wrong? 'Cause I decide to pay my wife a little visit." His words were slurred. She was wearing a sheer nightgown, and Jamie could see her ripe breasts straining against the fabric. God, she has a lovely body. He began to take off his clothes. Margaret leapt out of bed, her eyes very wide. "What are you doing?" Jamie kicked the door shut behind him and walked over to her. In a moment, he had thrown her onto the bed and he was next to her, naked. "God, I want you, Maggie." In his drunken confusion, he was not sure which Maggie he wanted. How she fought him. Yes, this was his little wildcat. He laughed as he finally managed to subdue her flailing arms and legs, and she was suddenly open to him and pulling him close and saying, "Oh, my darling Jamie. I need you so much," and he thought, "I shouldn't have been so mean to you. In the morning I'm gonna tell you you don't have to go back to Madame Agnes's." When Margaret awoke the next morning, she was alone in bed. She could still feel Jamie's strong male body inside hers and she heard him saying, "God, I want you, Maggie," and she was filled with a wild, complete joy. She had been right all along. He did love her. It had been worth the wait, worth the years of pain and loneliness and humiliation. Margaret spent the rest of the day in a state of rapture. She bathed and washed her hair and changed her mind a dozen times about which dress would please Jamie most. She sent the cook away so that she herself could prepare Jamie's favorite dishes. She set the dining room table again and again before she was satisfied with the candles and flowers. She wanted this to be a perfect evening. Jamie did not come home for dinner. Nor did he come home all night. Margaret sat in the library waiting for him until 3 o'clock in the morning, and then she went to her bed, alone. When Jamie returned home the following evening, he nodded politely to Margaret and walked on to his son's room. Margaret stood staring after him in stunned bewilderment, and then slowly turned to look at herself in the mirror. The mirror told her that she had never looked as beautiful, but when she looked closer she could not recognize the eyes. They were the eyes of a stranger. "Well, I have some wonderful news for you, Mrs. McGregor," Dr. Teager beamed. "You're going to have a baby." Margaret felt the shock of his words and did not know whether to laugh or cry. "Wonderful news. To bring another child into a loveless marriage was impossible. Margaret could no longer bear the humiliation. She would have to find a way out, and even as she was thinking it, she felt a sudden wave of nausea that left her drenched in perspiration. Dr. Teager was saying, "Morning sickness." "A bit." He handed her some pills. "Take these. They'll help. You're in excellent condition, Mrs. McGregor. Not a thing to worry about. You run along home and tell the good news to your husband." "Yes," she said dully. "I'll do that." They were at the dinner table when she said, "I saw the doctor today. I'm going to have a baby." Without a word, Jamie threw down his napkin, arose from his chair and stormed out of the room. That was the moment when Margaret learned she could hate Jamie McGregor as deeply as she could love him. It was a difficult pregnancy, and Margaret spent much of the time in bed, weak and tired. She lay there hour after hour, fantasizing, visualizing Jamie at her feet, begging for forgiveness, making wild love to her again. But they were only fantasies. The reality was that she was trapped. She had nowhere to go, and even if she could leave, he would never allow her to take her son with her. Jamie was 7 now, a healthy, handsome boy with a quick mind and a sense of humor. He had drawn closer to his mother, as though somehow sensing the unhappiness in her. He made little gifts for her in school and brought them home, and Margaret would smile and thank him and try to lift herself out of her depression. When young Jamie asked why his father stayed away nights and never took her out, Margaret would reply, "Your father is a very important man, Jamie, doing important things, and he's very busy. What's between his father and me is my problem," Margaret thought, "and I'll not have Jamie hating his father because of it." Margaret's pregnancy became more and more apparent. When she went out on the street, acquaintances would stop her and say, "It won't be long now, will it, Mrs. McGregor? FLL bet it's going to be a fine boy like little Jamie. Your husband must be a happy man." Behind her back, they said, "Poor thing. She's lookin' peaked, she must have found out about the whore he's taken as his mistress." Margaret tried to prepare young Jamie for the new arrival. "You're going to have a new brother or sister, darling. Then you'll have someone to play with all the time. Won't that be nice?" Jamie hugged her and said, "It will be more company for you, mother." And Margaret fought to keep back the tears. The labor pains began at 4 o'clock in the morning. Mrs. Talley sent for Hannah, and the baby was delivered at noon. It was a healthy baby girl, with her mother's mouth and her father's chin, and black hair curling around her little red face. Margaret named her Kate. It's a good, strong name, Margaret thought. And she's going to need her strength. We all are. I've got to take the children away from here. I don't know how yet, but I must find a way. David Blackwell burst into Jamie McGregor's office without knocking, and Jamie looked up in surprise. "What the hell? They're rioting at the Namab." Jamie stood up. What happened?" "One of the black boys was caught trying to steal a diamond. He cut a hole under his armpit and hid the stone inside it. As a lesson, Hans Zimmerman flogged him in front of the other workers. The boy died. He was 12 years old." Jamie's face filled with rage. "Sweet Jesus. I ordered a stop to flogging at all the mines. I warned Zimmerman. Get rid of the bastard. We can't find him." "Why not? The blacks have him. The situation's out of control." Jamie grabbed his hat. "Stay here and take care of things until I get back. I don't think it's safe for you to go up there, Mr. McGregor. The native that Zimmerman killed was from the Baralong tribe. They don't forgive, and they don't forget. I could." But Jamie was gone. When Jamie McGregor was 10 miles away from the diamond field, he could see the smoke. All the huts at the Namab had been set to the torch. The damned fools, Jamie thought. They're burning their own houses. As his carriage drew closer, he heard the sounds of gunshots and screams. Amid the mass confusion, uniformed constables were shooting at blacks and Coloreds who were desperately trying to flee. The whites were outnumbered 10 to 1, but they had the weapons. When the chief constable, Bernard Southey, saw Jamie McGregor, he hurried up to him and said, "Don't worry, Mr. McGregor. We'll get every last one of the bastards." "The hell you will," Jamie cried. "Order your men to stop shooting." "What if we do as I say?" Jamie watched, sick with rage, as a black woman fell under a hail of bullets. "Call your men off." "As you say, sir." The chief constable gave orders to an aide, and 3 minutes later all shooting had stopped. There were bodies on the ground everywhere. "If you want my advice," Southey said. I don't want your advice. Bring me their leader." 2 policemen brought a young black up to where Jamie was standing. He was handcuffed and covered with blood, but there was no fear in him. He stood tall and straight, his eyes blazing, and Jamie remembered Banda's word for Bantu pride, Isiko. "I'm Jamie McGregor." The man spat. "What happened here was not my doing. I want to make it up to your men. Tell that to their widows." Jamie turned to Southey. "Where's Hans Zimmerman?" "We're still looking for him, sir." Jamie saw the gleam in the black man's eyes, and he knew that Hans Zimmerman was not going to be found. He said to the man, "I'm closing the diamond field down for 3 days. I want you to talk to your people. Make a list of your complaints, and I'll look at it. I promise you I'll be fair. I'll change everything here that's not right." The man studied him, a look of skepticism on his face. "There will be a new foreman in charge here, and decent working conditions. But I'll expect your men back at work in 3 days." The chief constable said, incredulously, "You mean you're gonna let him go? He killed some of my men. There will be a full investigation, and—" There was the sound of a horse galloping toward them, and Jamie turned. It was David Blackwell, and the unexpected sight of him sounded an alarm in Jamie's mind. David leapt off his horse. "Mr. McGregor, your son has disappeared." The world suddenly grew cold. Half the population of Clipdrift turned out to join in the search. They covered the countryside, looking through gullies, ravines and clops. There was no trace of the boy. Jamie was like a man possessed. "He's wandered away somewhere, that's all, he'll be back." He went into Margaret's bedroom. She was lying in bed, nursing the baby. "Is there any news?" she demanded. "Not yet, but I'll find him." He looked at his baby daughter for an instant, then turned and walked out without another word. Mrs. Talley came into the room, twisting her hands in her apron. "Don't you worry, Mrs. McGregor. Jamie is a big boy. He knows how to take care of himself." Margaret's eyes were blinded by tears. "No one would harm little Jamie, would they?" "Of course not." Mrs. Talley reached down and took Kate from Margaret's arms. "Try to sleep." She took the baby into the nursery and laid her down in her crib. Kate was looking up at her, smiling. "You'd better get some sleep too, little one. You've got a busy life ahead of you." Mrs. Talley walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. At midnight, the bedroom window silently slid open and a man climbed into the room. He walked over to the crib, threw a blanket over the infant's head and scooped her up in his arms. Banda was gone as quickly as he had come. It was Mrs. Talley who discovered that Kate was missing. Her first thought was that Mrs. McGregor had come in the night and taken her. She walked into Margaret's bedroom and asked, "Where's the baby?" And from the look on Margaret's face, she knew instantly what had happened. As another day went by with no trace of his son, Jamie was on the verge of collapsing. He approached David Blackwell. "You don't think anything bad has happened to him?" His voice was barely under control. David tried to sound convincing. "I'm sure not, Mr. McGregor." But he was sure. He had warned Jamie McGregor that the Bantus neither forgave nor forgot, and it was a Bantu who had been cruelly murdered. David was certain of one thing: if the Bantus had taken little Jamie, he had died a horrible death, for they would exact their vengeance in kind. Jamie returned home at dawn, drained. He had led a search party of townspeople, diggers and constables, and they had spent the night looking without success in every conceivable place for the young boy. David was waiting when Jamie walked into the study. David rose to his feet. "Mr. McGregor, your daughter has been kidnapped." Jamie stared at him in silence, his face pale. Then he turned and walked into his bedroom. Jamie had not been to bed for 48 hours, and he fell into bed, utterly exhausted, and slept. He was under the shade of a large baobab tree, and in the distance across the trackless veldt a lion was moving toward him. Young Jamie was shaking him. "Wake up, Papa, a lion is coming." The animal was moving toward them faster now. His son was shaking him harder. "Wake up." Jamie opened his eyes. Banda was standing over him. Jamie started to speak, but Banda put a hand over Jamie's mouth. "Quiet," He allowed Jamie to sit up. "Where's my son?" Jamie demanded. "He's dead." The room began to spin. "I'm sorry. I was too late to stop them. Your people spilled Bantu blood. My people demanded vengeance." Jamie buried his face in his hands. "Oh, my God. What did they do to him?" There was a bottomless sorrow in Banda's voice. "They left him out in the desert. I found his body and buried him." "Oh, no. Oh, please, no. I tried to save him, Jamie." Jamie slowly nodded, accepting it. Then dully, "What about my daughter?" "I took her away before they could get her. She's back in her bedroom, asleep. She'll be all right if you do what you promised." Jamie looked up, and his face was a mask of hatred. "I'll keep my promise. But I want the men who killed my son. They're going to pay." Banda said quietly, "Then you will have to kill my whole tribe, Jamie." Banda was gone. It was only a nightmare, but she kept her eyes tightly closed, because she knew if she opened them the nightmare would become real and her children would be dead. So she played a game. She would keep her eyes squeezed shut until she felt little Jamie's hand on hers saying, "It's all right, mother. We're here. We're safe." She had been in bed for 3 days, refusing to talk to anyone or see anyone. Dr. Teacher came and went, and Margaret was not even aware of it. In the middle of the night Margaret was lying in bed with her eyes shut when she heard a loud crash from her son's room. She opened her eyes and listened. There was another sound. Little Jamie was back. Margaret hurriedly got out of bed and ran down the corridor toward the closed door of her son's room. Through the door, she could hear strange animal sounds. Her heart pounding wildly, she pushed the door open. Her husband lay on the floor, his face and body contorted. One eye was closed and the other stared up at her grotesquely. He was trying to speak, and the words came out as slobbering animal sounds. Margaret whispered, "Oh, Jamie, Jamie." Dr. Teacher said, "I'm afraid the news is bad, Mrs. McGregor. Your husband has had a severe stroke. There's a 50-50 chance he'll live, but if he does, he'll be a vegetable. I'll make arrangements to get him into a private sanitarium where he can get the proper care." "No." He looked at Margaret in surprise. "No. What?" "No hospital. I want him here with me." The doctor considered for a moment. "All right. You'll need a nurse. I'll arrange." "I don't want a nurse. I'll take care of Jamie myself." Dr. Teacher shook his head. "That won't be possible, Mrs. McGregor. You don't know what's involved. Your husband is no longer a functioning human being. He's completely paralyzed and will be for as long as he lives." Margaret said, "I'll take care of him." Now Jamie finally, truly, belonged to her. Jamie McGregor lived for exactly 1 year from the day he was taken ill, and it was the happiest time of Margaret's life. Jamie was totally helpless. He could neither talk nor move. Margaret cared for her husband, tended to all his needs, and kept him at her side day and night. During the day, she propped him up in a wheelchair in the sewing room, and while she knitted sweaters and throw robes for him, she talked to him. She discussed all the little household problems he had never had time to listen to before, and she told him how well little Kate was getting along. At night she carried Jamie's skeletal body to her bedroom and gently lay him in bed next to her. Margaret tucked him in and they had their one-sided chat until Margaret was ready to go to sleep. David Blackwell was running Kruger Brent, Limited. From time to time, David came to the house with papers for Margaret to sign, and it was painful for David to see the helpless condition Jamie was in. "I owe this man everything," David thought. "You chose well, Jamie," Margaret told her husband. "David is a fine man." She put down her knitting and smiled. "He reminds me of you a bit. Of course, there was never anyone as clever as you, my darling, and there never will be again. You were so fair to look at, Jamie, and so kind and strong. And you weren't afraid to dream. Now all your dreams have come true. The company is getting bigger every day." She picked up her knitting again. "Little Kate is beginning to talk. I'll swear she said, 'Mama,' this morning." Jamie sat there, propped up in his chair, one eye staring ahead. "She has your eyes and your mouth. She's going to grow up to be a beauty." The following morning when Margaret awakened, Jamie McGregor was dead. She took him in her arms and held him close to her. "Rest, my darling, rest. I've always loved you so much, Jamie. I hope you know that. Goodbye, my own dear love." She was alone now. Her husband and her son had left her. There was only herself and her daughter. Margaret walked into the baby's room and looked down at Kate, sleeping in her crib. Catherine. Kate. The name came from the Greek, and it meant clear or pure. It was a name given to saints and nuns and queens. Margaret said aloud, "Which are you going to be, Kate?" It was a time of great expansion in South Africa, but it was also a time of great strife. There was a long-standing Transvaal dispute between the Boers and the British, and it finally came to a head. On Thursday, October 12, 1899, on Kate's 7th birthday, the British declared war on the Boers, and 3 days later the Orange Free State was under attack. David tried to persuade Margaret to take Kate and leave South Africa, but Margaret refused to go. "My husband is here," she said. There was nothing David could do to dissuade her. "I'm going to join with the Boers." David told her. "Will you be all right?" "Yes, of course," Margaret said. "I'll try to keep the company going." The next morning David was gone. The British had expected a quick and easy war, no more than a mopping-up operation, and they began with a confident, light-hearted holiday spirit. At the Hyde Park Barracks in London, a send-off supper was given, with a special menu showing a British soldier holding up the head of a boar on a tray. The menu read, "Send-off supper to the Cape Squadron. November 27, 1899. Menu. Oysters, blue points. Compo soup. Toady in the hole. Sandy sole. Mafeking mutton. Transvaal turnips. Cape sauce. Pretoria pheasants. White sauce. Tinker taters. Peace pudding. Massa ices. Dutch cheese. Dessert. You are requested not to throw shells under the tables. Boer wines, Long Tom. Hollands in skin. Orange wine." The British were in for a surprise. The Boers were on their own home territory, and they were tough and determined. The first battle of the war took place in Mafeking, hardly more than a village, and for the first time, the British began to realize what they were up against. More troops were quickly sent over from England. They laid siege to Kimberley, and it was only after a fierce and bloody fight that they went on to take Ladysmith. The cannons of the Boers had a longer range than those of the British, so long-range guns were removed from British warships, moved inland and manned by sailors hundreds of miles from their ships. In Klipdrift, Margaret listened eagerly for news of each battle, and she and those around her lived on rumors, their moods varying from elation to despair, depending on the news. And then one morning one of Margaret's employees came running into her office and said, "I just heard a report that the British are advancing on Klipdrift. They're going to kill us all." "Nonsense. They wouldn't dare touch us." 5 hours later, Margaret McGregor was a prisoner of war. Margaret and Kate were taken to Paardeberg, one of the hundreds of prison camps that had sprung up all over South Africa. The prisoners were kept inside an enormous open field, ringed by barbed wire and guarded by armed British soldiers. The conditions were deplorable. Margaret took Kate in her arms and said, "Don't worry, darling, nothing's going to happen to you." But neither of them believed it. Each day became a calendar of horrors. They watched those around them die by the tens and the hundreds and then by the thousands as fever swept through the camp. There were no doctors or medication for the wounded, and food was scarce. It was a constant nightmare that went on for almost 3 harrowing years. The worst of it was the feeling of utter helplessness. Margaret and Kate were at the complete mercy of their captors. They were dependent upon them for meals and shelter, for their very lives. Kate lived in terror. She watched the children around her die, and she was afraid that she would be next. She was powerless to protect her mother or herself, and it was a lesson she was never to forget. Power. If you had power, you had food. You had medicine. I had freedom. She saw those around her fall ill and die, and she equated power with life. One day, Kate thought, "I'll have power. No one will be able to do this to me again." The violent battles went on, Belmont and Graspan and Stormberg and Spioenkop, but in the end, the brave Boers were no match for the might of the British Empire. In 1902, after nearly 3 years of bloody war, the Boers surrendered. 55,000 Boers fought, and 34,000 of their soldiers, women and children died. But what filled the survivors with a deep savage bitterness was the knowledge that 28,000 of those died in British concentration camps. On the day the gates of the camp were flung open, Margaret and Kate returned to Klipdrift. A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday, David Blackwell arrived. The war had matured him, but he was still the same grave, thoughtful David Margaret had learned to rely upon. David had spent these hellish years fighting and worrying about whether Margaret and Kate were dead or alive. When he found them safe at home, he was filled with joy. "I wish I could have protected you both," David told Margaret. "That's all past, David. We must think only of the future." And the future was Kruger Brent, Limited. For the world, the year 1900 was a clean slate on which history was going to be written, a new era that promised peace and limitless hope for everyone. A new century had begun, and it brought with it a series of astonishing inventions that reshaped life around the globe. Steam and electric automobiles were replaced by the combustion engine. There were submarines and airplanes. The world population exploded to 1.5 billion people. It was a time to grow and expand, and during the next 6 years, Margaret and David took full advantage of every opportunity. During those years, Kate grew up with almost no supervision. Her mother was too busy running the company with David to pay much attention to her. She was a wild child, stubborn and opinionated and intractable. One afternoon when Margaret came home from a business meeting, she saw her 14-year-old daughter in the muddy yard in a fistfight with 2 boys. Margaret stared in horrified disbelief. "Bloody hell," she said under her breath. "That's the girl who one day is going to run Kruger Brent, Limited. God help us all." Book 2. Kate and David 1906–1914. On a hot summer night in 1914, Kate McGregor was working alone in her office at the new Kruger Brent, Limited, headquarters building in Johannesburg when she heard the sound of approaching automobiles. She put down the papers she had been studying, walked over to the window and looked out. 2 cars of police and a paddy wagon had come to a stop in front of the building. Kate watched, frowning, as half a dozen uniformed policemen leapt from the cars and hurried to cover the 2 entrances and exits to the building. It was late, and the streets were deserted. Kate caught a wavy reflection of herself in the window. She was a beautiful woman, with her father's light gray eyes and her mother's full figure. There was a knock at the office door and Kate called, "Come in." The door opened and 2 uniformed men entered. One wore the bars of a superintendent of police. "What on earth is going on?" Kate demanded. "I apologize for disturbing you at this late hour, Miss McGregor. I'm Superintendent Kaminsky." "What's the problem, Superintendent?" "We've had a report that an escaped killer was seen entering this building a short time ago." There was a shocked look on Kate's face. "Entering this building?" "Yes, ma'am. He's armed and dangerous." Kate said nervously, "Then I would very much appreciate it, Superintendent, if you would find him and get him out of here." "That's exactly what we intend to do, Miss McGregor. You haven't seen or heard anything suspicious, have you?" "No. But I'm alone here, and there are a lot of places a person could hide. I'd like you to have your men search this place thoroughly." "We'll get started immediately, ma'am." The superintendent turned and called to the men in the hallway, "Spread out. Start at the basement and work your way up to the roof." He turned to Kate. "Are any of the offices locked?" "I don't believe so," Kate said, "but if they are, I'll open them for you." Superintendent Kaminsky could see how nervous she was, and he did not blame her. She would be even more nervous if she knew how desperate the man was for whom they were looking. "We'll find him," the superintendent assured Kate. Kate picked up the report she had been working on, but she was unable to concentrate. She could hear the police moving through the building, going from office to office. Would they find him? She shivered. The policemen moved slowly, methodically searching every possible hiding place from the basement to the roof. 45 minutes later, Superintendent Kaminsky returned to Kate's office. She looked at his face. "You didn't find him?" "Not yet, ma'am, but don't worry." "I am worried, Superintendent. If there is an escaped killer in this building, I want you to find him." "We will, Miss McGregor. We have tracking dogs." From the corridor came the sound of barking and a moment later a handler came into the office with 2 large German shepherds on leashes. "The dogs have been all over the building, sir. They've searched every place but this office." The superintendent turned to Kate. "Have you been out of this office any time in the past hour or so?" "Yes. I went to look up some records in the file room." "Do you think he could have?" She shuddered. I'd like you to check this office, please. The superintendent gave a signal and the handler slipped the leashes off the dogs and gave the command, track. The dogs went crazy. They raced to a closed door and began barking wildly. Oh, my God, Kate cried. He's in there. The superintendent pulled out his gun. Open it, he ordered. The two policemen moved to the closet door with drawn guns and pulled the door open. The closet was empty. One of the dogs raced to another door and pawed excitedly at it. Where does that door lead? Superintendent Kaminsky asked. To a washroom. The two policemen took up places on either side of the door and yanked it open. There was no one inside. The handler was baffled. They've never behaved this way before. The dogs were racing around the room frantically. They've got the scent, the handler said. But where is he? Both dogs ran to the drawer of Kate's desk and continued their barking. There's your answer, Kate tried to laugh. He's in the drawer. Superintendent Kaminsky was embarrassed. I'm sorry to have troubled you, Miss McGregor. He turned to the handler and snapped, take these dogs out of here. You're not leaving. There was concern in Kate's voice. Miss McGregor, I can assure you you're perfectly safe. My men have covered every inch of this building. You have my personal guarantee that he's not here. I'm afraid it was a false alarm. My apologies. Kate swallowed. You certainly know how to bring excitement to a woman's evening. Kate stood looking out the window, watching the last of the police vehicles drive away. When they were out of sight, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a blood-stained pair of canvas shoes. She carried them down the corridor to a door marked private, authorized personnel only, and entered. The room was bare except for a large, locked, walk-in safe built into the wall, the vault where Kruger Brent, Limited, stored its diamonds before shipping. Quickly, Kate dialed the combination on the safe and pulled open the giant door. Dozens of metal safe deposit boxes were built into the sides of the vault, all crammed with diamonds. In the center of the room, lying on the floor half-conscious, was Banda. Kate knelt beside him. They've gone. Banda slowly opened his eyes and managed a weak grin. If I had a way out of this vault, do you know how rich I'd be, Kate? Kate carefully helped him to his feet. He winced with pain as she touched his arm. She had wrapped a bandage around it, but blood was seeping through. Can you put your shoes on? She had taken them from him earlier, and, to confuse the tracking dogs she knew would be brought in, she had walked around her office in them and then hidden them in her drawer. Now Kate said, come on. We have to get you out of here. Banda shook his head. I'll make it on my own. If they catch you helping me, you'll be in more trouble than you can handle. Let me worry about that. Banda took a last look around the vault. Do you want any samples? Kate asked. You can help yourself. Banda looked at her and saw that she was serious. Your daddy made me that offer once, a long time ago. Kate smiled wryly. I know. I don't need money. I just have to leave town for a while. How do you think you're going to get out of Johannesburg? I'll find a way. Listen to me. The police have roadblocks out by now. Every exit from the city will be watched. You won't have a chance by yourself. He said stubbornly, you've done enough. He had managed to put his shoes on. He was a forlorn-looking figure, standing there in a torn, bloodied shirt and jacket. His face was seamed and his hair was gray, but when Kate looked at him she saw the tall, handsome figure she had first met as a child. Banda, if they catch you, they'll kill you, Kate said quietly. You're coming with me. She knew she was right about the roadblocks. Every exit from Johannesburg would be guarded by police patrols. Banda's capture was a top priority and the authorities had orders to bring him in dead or alive. The railroad stations and roads would be watched. I hope you have a better plan than your daddy had, Banda said. His voice was weak. Kate wondered how much blood he had lost. Don't talk. Save your strength. Just leave everything to me. Kate sounded more confident than she felt. Banda's life was in her hands, and she could not bear it if anything happened to him. She wished again, for the 100th time, that David was not away. Well, she would simply have to manage without him. I'm going to bring my automobile around to the alley, Kate said. Give me 10 minutes, then come outside. I'll have the back door of the car open. Get in and he on the floor. There will be a blanket to cover yourself with. Kate, they're going to search every automobile leaving the city. If We're not going by automobile. There's a train leaving for Cape Town at 8 a.m. I ordered my private car connected to it. You're getting me out of here in your private railroad car. That's right. Banda managed a grin. You McGregors really like excitement. 30 minutes later, Kate drove into the railroad yards. Banda was on the floor of the backseat, concealed by a blanket. They had had no trouble passing the roadblocks in the city, but now as Kate's car turned into the train yards, a light suddenly flashed on, and Kate saw that her way was blocked by several policemen. A familiar figure walked toward Kate's car. Superintendent Kaminsky. He registered surprise. Miss McGregor, what are you doing here? Kate gave him a quick, apprehensive smile. You'll think I'm just a silly, weak female, superintendent, but to tell you the truth, what happened back at the office scared the wits out of me. I decided to leave town until you catch this killer you're looking for. Or have you found him? Not yet, ma'am, but we will. I have a feeling he'll make for these railroad yards. Wherever he runs, we'll catch him. I certainly hope so. Where are you headed? My railway car is on a siding up ahead. FM taking it to Cape Town. Would you like one of my men to escort you? Oh, thank you, Superintendent, but that won't be necessary. Now that I know where you and your men are, I'll breathe a lot easier, believe me. 5 minutes later, Kate and Banda were safely inside the private railway car. It was pitch black. Sorry about the dark, Kate said. I don't want to light any lamps. She helped Banda onto a bed. You'll be fine here until morning. When we start to pull out, you'll hide out in the washroom. Banda nodded. Thank you. Kate drew the shades. Have you a doctor who will take care of you when we get to Cape Town? He looked up into her eyes. You didn't think I was going to let you travel alone while I missed all the fun. Banda threw back his head and laughed. She's her father's daughter, all right. As dawn was breaking, an engine pulled up to the private railroad car and shunted it onto the main track in back of the train that was leaving for Cape Town. The car rocked back and forth as the connection was made. At exactly 8 o'clock, the train pulled out of the station. Kate had left word that she did not wish to be disturbed. Banda's wound was bleeding again, and Kate attended to it. She had not had a chance to talk to Banda since earlier that evening, when he had stumbled half dead into her office. Now she said, "Tell me what happened, Banda." Banda looked at her and thought, where can I begin? How could he explain to her the Trekboers who pushed the Bantus from their ancestral land? Had it started with them? Or had it started with the giant Paul Kruger, president of the Transvaal, who said in a speech to the South African Parliament, "We must be the lords over the blacks and let them be a subject race"? Or had it begun with the great empire builder Cecil Rhodes, whose motto was, "Africa for the whites"? How could he sum up the history of his people in a sentence? He thought of a way. The police murdered my son, Banda said. The story came pouring out. Banda's older son, Ntombenthal, was attending a political rally when the police charged in to break it up. Some shots were fired, and a riot began. Ntombenthal was arrested, and the next morning he was found hanged in his cell. They said it was suicide, Banda told Kate. But I know my son. It was murder. My God, he was so young, Kate breathed. She thought of all the times they had played together, laughed together. Ntombenthal had been such a handsome boy. I'm sorry, Banda. I'm so sorry. But why are they after you? After they killed him I began to rally the blacks. I had to fight back, Kate. I couldn't just sit and do nothing. The police called me an enemy of the state. They arrested me for a robbery I did not commit and sentenced me to prison for 20 years. 4 of us made a break. A guard was shot and killed, and they're blaming me. I've never carried a gun in my life. I believe you, Kate said. The first thing we have to do is get you somewhere where you'll be safe. I'm sorry to involve you in all this. You didn't involve me in anything. You're my friend. He smiled. You know the first white man I ever heard call me friend. Your daddy. He sighed. How do you think you're going to sneak me off the train at Cape Town? We're not going to Cape Town. But you said. I'm a woman. I have a right to change my mind. In the middle of the night when the train stopped at the station at Worcester, Kate arranged to have her private railroad car disconnected and shunted to a siding. When Kate woke up in the morning, she went over to Banda's cot. It was empty. Banda was gone. He had refused to compromise her any further. Kate was sorry, but she was sure he would be safe. He had many friends to take care of him. David will be proud of me, Kate thought. I can't believe you could be so stupid, David roared, when Kate returned to Johannesburg and told him the news. You not only jeopardized your own safety, but you put the company in danger. If the police had found Banda here, do you know what they would have done? Kate said defiantly, yes. They would have killed him. David rubbed Biff's forehead in frustration. Don't you understand anything? You're bloody right, I do. I understand that you're cold and unfeeling. Her eyes were ablaze with fury. You're still a child. She raised her hand to strike him, and David grabbed her arms. Kate, you've got to control your temper. The words reverberated in Kate's head. Kate, you've got to learn to control your temper. It was so long ago. She was 4 years old, in the middle of a fistfight with a boy who had dared tease her. When David appeared, the boy ran away. Kate started to chase him, and David grabbed her. Hold it, Kate. You've got to learn to control your temper. Young ladies don't get into fistfights. I'm not a young lady, Kate snapped. Let go of me. David released her. The pink frock she was wearing was muddied and torn, and her cheek was bruised. We'd better get you cleaned up before your mother sees you, David told her. Kate looked after the retreating boy with regret. I could have licked him if you had left me alone. David looked down into the passionate little face and laughed. You probably could have. Mollified, Kate allowed him to pick her up and carry her into her house. She liked being in David's arms. She liked everything about David. He was the only grown-up who understood her. Whenever he was in town, he spent time with her. In relaxed moments, Jamie had told young David about his adventures with Banda, and now David told the stories to Kate. She could not get enough of them. Tell me again about the raft they built. And David would tell her. Tell me about the sharks. Tell me about the sea Miz. Tell me about the day. Kate did not see very much of her mother. Margaret was too involved in running the affairs of Kruger Brent, Limited. She did it for Jamie. Margaret talked to Jamie every night, just as she had during the year before he died. David is such a great help, Jamie, and he'll be around when Kate's running the company. I don't want to worry you, but I don't know what to do with that child. Kate was stubborn and willful and impossible. She refused to obey her mother or Mrs. Talley. If they chose a dress for her to wear, Kate would discard it for another. She would not eat properly. She ate what she wanted to, when she wanted to, and no threat or bribe could sway her. When Kate was forced to go to a birthday party, she found ways to disrupt it. She had no girlfriends. She refused to go to dancing class and instead spent her time playing rugby with teenage boys. When Kate finally started school, she set a record for mischief. Margaret found herself going to see the headmistress at least once a month to persuade her to forgive Kate and let her remain in school. I don't understand her, Mrs. McGregor, the headmistress sighed. She's extremely bright, but she rebels against simply everything. I don't know what to do with her. Neither did Margaret. The only one who could handle Kate was David. I understand you're invited to a birthday party this afternoon, David said. I hate birthday parties. David stooped down until he was at her eye level. I know you do, Kate. But the father of the little girl who's having the birthday party is a friend of mine. It will make me look bad if you don't attend and behave like a lady. Kate stared at him. Is he a good friend of yours? Yes. I'll go. Her manners that afternoon were impeccable. I don't know how you do it, Margaret told David. It's magic. She's just high-spirited, David laughed. She'll grow out of it. The important thing is to be careful not to break that spirit. I'll tell you a secret, Margaret said grimly, half the time I'd like to break her neck. When Kate was 10, she said to David, I want to meet Banda. David looked at her in surprise. I'm afraid that's not possible, Kate. Banda's farm is a long way from here. Are you going to take me there, David, or do you want me to go by myself? The following week David took Kate to Banda's farm. It was a good-sized piece of land, 2 morgens, and on it Banda raised wheat, sheep and ostriches. The living accommodations were circular huts with walls made of dried mud. Poles supported a cone-shaped roof covered with thatches. Banda stood in front, watching as Kate and David drove up and got out of the carriage. Banda looked at the gangling, serious-faced girl at David's side and said, "I'd have known you were Jamie McGregor's daughter." "And I'd have known you were Banda," Kate said gravely. "I came to thank you for saving my father's life." Banda laughed. "Someone's been telling you stories. Come in and meet my family." Banda's wife was a beautiful Bantu woman named Entame. Banda had 2 sons, Entombenthal, 7 years older than Kate, and Magina, 6 years older. Entombenthal was a miniature of his father. He had the same handsome features and proud bearing and an inner dignity. Kate spent the entire afternoon playing with the 2 boys. They had dinner in the kitchen of the small, neat farmhouse. David felt uncomfortable eating with a black family. He respected Banda, but it was traditional that there was no socializing between the 2 races. In addition to that, David was concerned about Banda's political activities. There were reports that he was a disciple of John Tengo Javabu, who was fighting for drastic social changes. Because mine owners could not get enough natives to work for them, the government had imposed a tax of 10 shillings on all natives who did not work as mine laborers, and there were riots all over South Africa. In the late afternoon, David said, "We'd better get started home, Kate. We have a long ride." "Not yet." Kate turned to Banda. "Tell me about the sharks." From that time on, whenever David was in town, Kate made him take her to visit Banda and his family. David's assurance that Kate would grow out of her high-spiritedness showed no signs of coming to pass. If anything, she grew more willful every day. She flatly refused to take part in any of the activities that other girls her age participated in. She insisted on going into the mines with David, and he took her hunting and fishing and camping. Kate adored it. One day when Kate and David were fishing the Vaal, and Kate gleefully pulled in a trout larger than anything David had caught, he said, "You should have been born a boy." She turned to him in annoyance. "Don't be silly, David. Then I couldn't marry you." David laughed. "We are going to be married, you know." "I'm afraid not, Kate. I'm 22 years older than you. Old enough to be your father. You'll meet a boy one day, a nice young man." "I don't want a nice young man," she said wickedly. "I want you." "If you're really serious," David said, "then I'll tell you the secret to a man's heart." "Tell me," Kate said eagerly. Through his stomach. "Clean the trout and let's have lunch." There was not the slightest doubt in Kate's mind that she was going to marry David Blackwell. He was the only man in the world for her. Once a week Margaret invited David to dinner at the big house. As a rule, Kate preferred to eat dinner in the kitchen with the servants, where she did not have to mind her manners. But on Friday nights when David came, Kate sat in the big dining room. David usually came alone, but occasionally he would bring a female guest and Kate would hate her instantly. Kate would get David alone for a moment and say, with sweet innocence, "I've never seen hair that shade of blonde," or, "She certainly has peculiar taste in dresses, hasn't she?" Or, "Did she used to be one of Madame Agnes's girls?" When Kate was 14, her headmistress sent for Margaret. "I run a respectable school, Mrs. McGregor. I'm afraid your Kate is a bad influence." Margaret sighed. "What's she done now?" "She's teaching the other children words they've never heard before." Her face was grim. "I might add, Mrs. McGregor, that I've never heard some of the words before. I can't imagine where the child picked them up." Margaret could. Kate picked them up from her street friends. Well, Margaret decided, it is time to end all that. The headmistress was saying, "I do wish you would speak to her. We'll give her another chance, but..." "No. I have a better idea. I'm going to send Kate away to school." When Margaret told David her idea, he grinned. "She's not going to like that." "I can't help it. Now the headmistress is complaining about the language Kate uses. She gets it from those prospectors she's always following around. My daughter's starting to sound like them, look like them and smell like them. Frankly, David, I don't understand her at all. I don't know why she behaves as she does. She's pretty, she's bright, maybe she's too bright. Well, too bright or not, she's going away to school." When Kate arrived home that afternoon, Margaret broke the news to her. Kate was furious. "You're trying to get rid of me." "Of course I'm not, darling. I just think you'd be better off." "I'm better off here. All my friends are here. You're trying to separate me from my friends. If you're talking about that riffraff you They're not riffraff. They're as good as anybody. Kate, I'm not going to argue with you. You're going away to a boarding school for young ladies, and that's that. I'll kill myself, Kate promised. All right, darling. There's a razor upstairs, and if you look around, I'm sure you'll find various poisons in the house. Kate burst into tears. Please don't do this to me, Mother. Margaret took her in her arms. It's for your own good, Kate. You'll be a young woman soon. You'll be ready for marriage. No man is going to marry a girl who talks and dresses and behaves the way you do. That's not true, Kate sniffled. David doesn't mind. What does David have to do with this? We're going to be married. Margaret sighed. I'll have Mrs. Talley pack your things. There were half a dozen good English boarding schools for young girls. Margaret decided that Cheltenham, in Gloucestershire, was best suited for Kate. It was a school noted for its rigid discipline. It was set on acres of land surrounded by high battlements and, according to its charter, was founded for the daughters of noblemen and gentlemen. David did business with the husband of the headmistress, Mrs. Keaton, and he had no trouble arranging for Kate to be enrolled there. When Kate heard where she was going, she exploded anew. I've heard about that school. It's awful. I'll come back like one of those stuffed English dolls. Is that what you'd like? What I would like is for you to learn some manners, Margaret told her. I don't need manners. I've got brains. That's not the first thing a man looks for in a woman, Margaret said dryly, and you're becoming a woman. I don't want to become a woman, Kate screamed. Why the bloody hell can't you just leave me alone? I will not have you using that language. And so it went until the morning arrived when Kate was to leave. Since David was going to London on a business trip, Margaret asked, would you mind seeing that Kate gets to school safely? The Lord only knows where she'll end up if she goes on her own. I'll be happy to, David said. You're as bad as my mother. You can't wait to get rid of me. David grinned. You're wrong. I can wait. They traveled by private railway car from Clipdrift to Cape Town and from there by ship to Southampton. The journey took 4 weeks. Kate's pride would not let her admit it, but she was thrilled to be traveling with David. It's like a honeymoon, she thought, except that we're not married. Not yet. Aboard ship, David spent a great deal of time working in his stateroom. Kate curled up on the couch, silently watching him, content to be near him. Once she asked, don't you get bored working on all those figures, David? He put down his pen and looked at her. They're not just figures, Kate. They're stories. What kind of stories? If you know how to read them, they're stories about companies we're buying or selling, people who work for us. Thousands of people all over the world earn a living because of the company your father founded. Am I anything like my father? In many ways, yes. He was a stubborn, independent man. Am I a stubborn, independent woman? You're a spoiled brat. The man who marries you is going to have one hell of a life. Kate smiled dreamily. Poor David. In the dining room, on their last night at sea, David asked, why are you so difficult, Kate? Am I? You know you are. You drive your poor mother crazy. Kate put her hand over his. Do I drive you crazy? David's face reddened. Stop that. I don't understand you. Yes, you do. Why can't you be like other girls your age? I'd rather die first. I don't want to be like anybody else. God knows you're not. You won't marry anyone else until I'm grown up enough for you, will you, David? I'll get older as fast as I can. I promise. Just don't meet anybody you love, please. He was touched by her earnestness. He took her hand in his and said, Kate, when I get married, I'd like my daughter to be exactly like you. Kate rose to her feet and said in a voice that rang through the dining salon, you can bloody well go to hell, David Blackwell. And she stormed out of the room, as everyone stared. They had 3 days together in London, and Kate loved every minute of it. I have a treat for you, David told her. I got 2 tickets for Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. Thank you, David. I want to go to the Gaiety. You can't. That's a music hall review. That's not for you. I won't know until I see it, will I? She said stubbornly. They went to the Gaiety. Kate loved the look of London. The mixture of motorcars and carriages, the ladies beautifully dressed in lace and tulle and light satins and glittering jewelry, and the men in dinner clothes with peak waistcoats and white shirt fronts. They had dinner at the Ritz, and a late supper at the Savoy. And when it was time to leave, Kate thought, we'll come back here. David and I will come back here. When they arrived at Cheltenham, they were ushered into the office of Mrs. Keaton. I want to thank you for enrolling Kate, David said. I'm sure we'll enjoy having her. And it's a pleasure to accommodate a friend of my husband. At that moment, Kate knew she had been deceived. It was David who had wanted her sent away and had arranged for her to come here. She was so furious and hurt she refused to say goodbye to him. Cheltenham School was unbearable. There were rules and regulations for everything. The girls had to wear identical uniforms, down to their knickers. The school day was 10 hours long, and every minute was rigidly structured. Mrs. Keaton ruled the pupils and her staff with a rod of iron. The girls were there to learn manners and discipline, etiquette and decorum, so that they could one day attract desirable husbands. Kate wrote her mother, "It's a bloody prison. The girls here are awful. All they ever talk about are bloody clothes and bloody boys. The bloody teachers are monsters. They'll never keep me here. I'm going to escape." Kate managed to run away from the school 3 times, and each time she was caught and brought back, unrepentant. At a weekly staff meeting, when Kate's name was brought up, one of the teachers said, "The child is uncontrollable. I think we should send her back to South Africa." Mrs. Keaton replied, "I'm inclined to agree with you, but let's look upon it as a challenge. If we can succeed in disciplining Kate McGregor, we can succeed in disciplining anyone." Kate remained in school. To the amazement of her teachers, Kate became interested in the farm that the school maintained. The farm had vegetable gardens, chickens, cows, pigs and horses. Kate spent as much time as possible there, and when Mrs. Keaton learned of this, she was immensely pleased. You see, the headmistress told her staff, it was simply a question of patience. Kate has finally found her interest in life. One day she will marry a landowner and be of enormous assistance to him. The following morning, Oscar Denker, the man in charge of running the farm, came to see the headmistress. "One of your students," he said, "that Kate McGregor, I wish you'd keep her away from my farm." "Whatever are you talking about?" Mrs. Keaton asked. "I happen to know she's very interested." "Sure she is, but do you know what she's interested in?" "The animals fornicating, if you'll excuse my language." "What?" "That's right. She stands around all day, just watching the animals do it to each other." "Bloody hell," Mrs. Keaton said. Kate still had not forgiven David for sending her into exile, but she missed him terribly. "It's my fate," she thought gloomily, "to be in love with a man I hate." She counted the days she was away from him, like a prisoner marking time until the day of release. Kate was afraid he would do something dreadful, like marry another woman while she was trapped in the bloody school. If he does, Kate thought, I'll kill them both. No, I'll just kill her. They'll arrest me and hang me, and when I'm on the gallows, he'll realize that he loves me. But it will be too late. He'll beg me to forgive him. Yes, David, my darling, I forgive you. You were too foolish to know when you held a great love in the palm of your hand. You let it fly away like a little bird. Now that little bird is about to be hanged. Goodbye, David. But at the last minute she would be reprieved and David would take her in his arms and carry her off to some exotic country where the food was better than the bloody slop they served at bloody Cheltenham. Kate received a note from David saying he was going to be in London and would come to visit her. Kate's imagination was inflamed. She found a dozen hidden meanings in his note. Why was he going to be in England? To be near her, of course. Why was he coming to visit her? Because he finally knew he loved her and could not bear to be away from her any longer. He was going to sweep her off her feet and take her out of this terrible place. She could scarcely contain her happiness. Kate's fantasy was so real that the day David arrived, Kate went around saying goodbye to her classmates. My lover is coming to take me out of here, she told them. The girls looked at her in silent disbelief. All except Georgina Christie, who scoffed. You're lying again, Kate McGregor. Just wait and see. He's tall and handsome, and he's mad about me. When David arrived, he was puzzled by the fact that all the girls in the school seemed to be staring at him. They looked at him and whispered and giggled, and the minute they caught his eye, they blushed and turned away. They act as though they've never seen a man before, David told Kate. He looked at her suspiciously. Have you been saying anything about me? Of course not, Kate said haughtily. Why would I do that? They ate in the school's large dining room, and David brought Kate up to date on everything that was happening at home. Your mother sends her love. She's expecting you home for the summer holiday. How is mother? She's fine. She's working hard. Is the company doing well, David? He was surprised by her sudden interest. It's doing very well. Why? Because, Kate thought, someday it will belong to me, and you and I will share it. I was just curious. He looked at her untouched plate. You're not eating. Kate was not interested in food. She was waiting for the magic moment, the moment when David would say, "Come away with me, Kate. You're a woman now, and I want you. We're going to be married." The dessert came and went. Coffee came and went, and still no magic words from David. It was not until he looked at his watch and said, "Well, I'd better be going or I'll miss my train," that Kate realized with a feeling of horror that he had not come to take her away at all. The bastard was going to leave her there to rot. David had enjoyed his visit with Kate. She was a bright and amusing child, and the waywardness she had once shown was now under control. David patted Kate's hand fondly and asked, "Is there anything I can do for you before I leave, Kate?" She looked him in the eye and said sweetly, "Yes, David, there is. You can do me an enormous favor. Get out of my bloody life." And she walked out of the room with great dignity, her head held high, leaving him sitting there, mouth agape. Margaret found that she missed Kate. The girl was unruly and contrary, but Margaret realized that she was the only living person she loved. She's going to be a great woman, Margaret thought with pride. But I want her to have the manners of a lady. Kate came home for summer vacation. How are you getting along in school? Margaret asked. I hate it. It's like being surrounded by 100 nannies. Margaret studied her daughter. Do the other girls feel the same way, Kate? What do they know? She said contemptuously. You should see the girls at that school. They've been sheltered all their lives. They don't know a damn thing about life. Oh, dear, Margaret said. That must be awful for you. Don't laugh at me, please. They've never even been to South Africa. The only animals they've seen have been in zoos. None of them has ever seen a diamond mine or a gold mine. Underprivileged. Kate said, all right. But when I turn out like them, you're going to be bloody sorry. Do you think you'll turn out like them? Kate grinned wickedly. Of course not. Are you mad? An hour after Kate arrived home, she was outside playing rugby with the children of the servants. Margaret watched her through the window and thought, I'm wasting my money. She's never going to change. That evening, at dinner, Kate asked casually, is David in town? He's been in Australia. He'll be back tomorrow, I think. Is he coming to dinner Friday night? Probably. She studied Kate and said, you like David, don't you? She shrugged. He's all right, I suppose. I see, Margaret said. She smiled to herself as she remembered Kate's vow to marry David. I don't dislike him, Mother. I mean, I like him as a human being. I just can't stand him as a man. When David arrived for dinner Friday night, Kate flew to the door to greet him. She hugged him and whispered in his ear, I forgive you. Oh, I've missed you so much, David. Have you missed me? Automatically he said, yes. And then he thought with astonishment, by God, I have missed her. He had never known anyone like this child. He had watched her grow up, and each time he encountered her she was a revelation to him. She was almost 16 years old and she had started to fill out. She had let her black hair grow long, and it fell softly over her shoulders. Her features had matured, and there was a sensuality about her that he had not noticed before. She was a beauty, with a quick intelligence and a strong will. She's going to be a handful for some man, David thought. At dinner David asked, how are you getting along in school, Kate? Oh, I just love it, she gushed. I'm really learning a lot. The teachers are wonderful, and I've made a lot of great friends. Margaret sat in stunned silence. David, will you take me to the mines with you? Is that how you want to waste your vacation? Yes, please. A trip down into the mines took a full day, and that meant she would be with David all that time. If your mother says it's all right. Please, Mother. All right, darling. As long as you're with David, I know you'll be safe. Margaret hoped David would be safe. The Kruger-Brent diamond mine near Bloemfontein was a gigantic operation, with hundreds of workers engaged in digging, engineering, washing or sorting. "This is one of the company's most profitable mines," David told Kate. They were above ground in the manager's office, waiting for an escort to take them down into the mine. Against one wall was a showcase filled with diamonds of all colors and sizes. "Each diamond has a distinct characteristic," David explained. "The original diamonds from the banks of the Vaal are alluvial, and their sides are worn down from the abrasion of centuries." "He's more handsome than ever," Kate thought. "I love his eyebrows." These stones all come from different mines, but they can be easily identified by their appearance. "See this one? You can tell by the size and yellow cast that it comes from Pardspan. De Beers's diamonds have an oily-looking surface and are dodecahedral in shape. He's brilliant. He knows everything. You can tell this one is from the mine at Kimberley because it's an octahedron. Their diamonds range from smoky glassy to pure white. I wonder if the manager thinks David is my lover. I hope so." The color of a diamond helps determine its value. The colors are named on a scale of 1 to 10. At the top is the tone blue-white, and at the bottom is the draw, which is a brown color. "He smells so wonderful. It's such a male smell. I love his arms and shoulders. I wish." "Kate." She said guiltily, "Yes, David. Are you listening to me?" "Of course I am." There was indignation in her voice. Steve heard every word. They spent the next 2 hours in the bowels of the mine, and then had lunch. It was Kate's idea of a heavenly day. When Kate returned home late in the afternoon, Margaret said, "Did you enjoy yourself?" "It was wonderful. Mining is really fascinating." Half an hour later, Margaret happened to glance out the window. Kate was on the ground wrestling with the son of one of the gardeners. The following year, Kate's letters from school were cautiously optimistic. She had been made captain of the hockey and lacrosse teams, and was at the head of her class scholastically. The school was not really all that bad, she wrote, and there were even a few girls in her classes who were reasonably nice. She asked permission to bring 2 of her friends home for the summer vacation, and Margaret was delighted. The house would be alive again with the sound of youthful laughter. She could not wait for her daughter to come home. Her dreams were all for Kate now. "Jamie and I are the past," Maggie thought. "Kate is the future. And what a wonderful, bright future it will bet." When Kate was home during her vacation, all the eligible young men of Klipdrift flocked around besieging her for dates, but Kate was not interested in any of them. David was in America, and she impatiently awaited his return. When he came to the house, Kate greeted him at the door. She wore a white dress circled in by a black velvet belt that accentuated her lovely bosom. When David embraced her, he was astonished by the warmth of her response. He drew back and looked at her. There was something different about her, something knowing. There was an expression in her eyes he could not define, and it made him vaguely uneasy. The few times David saw Kate during that vacation, she was surrounded by boys, and he found himself wondering which would be the lucky one. David was called back to Australia on business, and when he returned to Klipdrift, Kate was on her way to England. In Kate's last year of school, David appeared unexpectedly one evening. Usually his visits were preceded by a letter or a telephone call. This time there had been no warning. "David, what a wonderful surprise." Kate hugged him. "You should have told me you were coming." "I would have." "Kate, I've come to take you home." She pulled back and looked up at him. "Is something wrong?" "I'm afraid your mother is very ill." Kate stood stark still for a moment. "I'll get ready." Kate was shocked by her mother's appearance. She had seen her only a few months earlier, and Margaret had seemed to be in robust health. Now she was pale and emaciated, and the bright spirit had gone out of her eyes. It was as though the cancer that was eating at her flesh had also eaten at her soul. Kate sat at the side of the bed and held her mother's hand in hers. "Oh, Mother," she said. "I'm so bloody sorry." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'm ready, darling. I suppose I've been ready ever since your father died." She looked up at Kate. "Do you want to hear something silly? I've never told this to a living soul before." She hesitated, then went on. "I've always been worried that there was no one to take proper care of your father. Now I can do it." Margaret was buried 3 days later. Her mother's death shook Kate deeply. She had lost her father and a brother, but she had never known them, they were only storied figments of the past. Her mother's death was real and painful. Kate was 18 years old and suddenly alone in the world, and the thought of that was frightening. David watched her standing at her mother's graveside, bravely fighting not to cry. But when they returned to the house, Kate broke down, unable to stop sobbing. She was always so wonderful to me, David, and I was such a rotten daughter. David tried to console her. You've been a wonderful daughter, Kate. I was nothing but trouble. I'd give anything if I could make it up to her. I didn't want her to die, David. Why did God do this to her? He waited, letting Kate cry herself out. When she was calmer, David said, I know it's hard to believe now, but one day this pain will go away. And you know what you'll be left with, Kate? Happy memories. You'll remember all the good things you and your mother had. I suppose so. Only right now it hurts so bloody much. The following morning they discussed Kate's future. You have family in Scotland, David reminded her. No, Kate replied sharply. They're not family. They're relatives. Her voice was bitter. When father wanted to come to this country, they laughed at him. No one would help him except his mother, and she's dead. No, I won't have anything to do with them. David sat there thinking, do you plan to finish out the school term? Before Kate could answer, David went on. I think your mother would have wanted you to. Then I'll do it. She looked down at the floor, her eyes unseeing. Bloody hell, Kate said. I know, David said gently. I know. Kate finished the school term as class valedictorian, and David was there for the graduation. Riding from Johannesburg to Klipdrift in the private railway car, David said, you know, all this will belong to you in a few years. This car, the mines, the company, it's yours. You're a very rich young woman. You can sell the company for many millions of pounds. He looked at her and added, or you can keep it. You'll have to think about it. I have thought about it, Kate told him. She looked at him and smiled. My father was a pirate, David. A wonderful old pirate. I wish I could have known him. I'm not going to sell this company. Do you know why? Because the pirate named it after two guards who were trying to kill him. Wasn't that a lovely thing to do? Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I think about my father and Banda crawling through the sea miz, and I can hear the voices of the guards, Kruger. Brent. She looked up at David. No, I'll never sell my father's company. Not as long as you'll stay on and run it. David said quietly, I'll stay as long as you need me. I've decided to enroll in a business school. A business school. There was surprise in his voice. This is 1910, Kate reminded him. They have business schools in Johannesburg where women are allowed to attend. But you asked me what I wanted to do with my money. She looked him in the eye and said, I want to earn it. Business school was an exciting new adventure. When Kate had gone to Cheltenham, it had been a chore, a necessary evil. This was different. Every class taught her something useful, something that would help her when she ran the company. The courses included accounting, management, international trade and business administration. Once a week David telephoned to see how she was getting along. I love it, Kate told him. It's really exciting, David. One day she and David would be working together, side by side, late at night, all by themselves. And one of those nights, David would turn to her and say, Kate, darling, I've been such a blind fool. Will you marry me? And an instant later, she would be in his arms. But that would have to wait. In the meantime, she had a lot to learn. Resolutely, Kate turned to her homework. The business course lasted 2 years, and Kate returned to Klipdrift in time to celebrate her 20th birthday. David met her at the station. Impulsively, Kate flung her arms around him and hugged him. Oh, David, I'm so happy to see you. He pulled away and said awkwardly, It's nice to see you, Kate. There was an uncomfortable stiffness in his manner. Is something wrong? No. It's just that young ladies don't go around hugging men in public. She looked at him a moment. I see. I promise not to embarrass you again. As they drove to the house, David covertly studied Kate. She was a hauntingly beautiful girl, innocent and vulnerable, and David was determined that he would never take advantage of that. On Monday morning Kate moved into her new office at Kruger Brent, Limited. It was like suddenly being plunged into some exotic and bizarre universe that had its own customs and its own language. There was a bewildering array of divisions, subsidiaries, regional departments, franchises and foreign branches. The products that the company manufactured or owned seemed endless. There were steel mills, cattle ranches, a railroad, a shipping line and, of course, the foundation of the family fortune. Diamonds and gold, zinc and platinum and magnesium, mined each hour around the clock, pouring into the coffers of the company. Power. It was almost too much to take in. Kate sat in David's office listening to him make decisions that affected thousands of people around the world. The general managers of the various divisions made recommendations, but as often as not, David overruled them. "Why do you do that? Don't they know their jobs?" Kate asked. "Of course they do, but that's not the point," David explained. "Each manager sees his own division as the center of the world, and that's as it should be. But someone has to have an overall view and decide what's best for the company. Come on, we're having lunch with someone I want you to meet." David took Kate into the large, private dining room adjoining Kate's office. A young, raw-boned man with a lean face and inquisitive brown eyes was waiting for them. "This is Brad Rogers," David said. "Brad, meet your new boss, Kate McGregor." Brad Rogers held out his hand. "I'm pleased to meet you, Miss McGregor." "Brad is our secret weapon," David said. "He knows as much about Kruger Brent, Limited, as I do. If I ever leave, you don't have to worry. Brad will be here. If I ever leave." The thought of it sent a wave of panic through Kate. Of course, David would never leave the company. Kate could think of nothing else through lunch, and when it was over she had no idea what she had eaten. After lunch, they discussed South Africa. "We're going to run into trouble soon," David warned. "The government has just imposed poll taxes." "Exactly what does that mean?" Kate asked. "It means that blacks, coloreds and Indians have to pay £2 each for every member of their family. That's more than a month's wages for them." Kate thought about Banda and was filled with a sense of apprehension. The discussion moved on to other topics. Kate enjoyed her new life tremendously. Every decision involved a gamble of millions of pounds. Big business was a matching of wits, the courage to gamble and the instinct to know when to quit and when to press ahead. "Business is a game," David told Kate, "played for fantastic stakes, and you're in competition with experts. If you want to win, you have to learn to be a master of the game." And that was what Kate was determined to do. Learn. Kate lived alone in the big house, except for the servants. She and David continued their ritual Friday night dinners, but when Kate invited him over on any other night, he invariably found an excuse not to come. During business hours they were together constantly, but even then David seemed to have erected a barrier between them, a wall that Kate was unable to penetrate. On her 21st birthday, all the shares in Kruger Brent, Limited, were turned over to Kate. She now officially had control of the company. "Let's have dinner tonight to celebrate," she suggested to David. "I'm sorry, Kate, I have a lot of work to catch up on." Kate dined alone that night, wondering why. Was it she, or was it David? He would have to be deaf, dumb and blind not to know how she felt about him, how she had always felt about him. She would have to do something about it. The company was negotiating for a shipping line in the United States. "Why don't you and Brad go to New York and close the deal?" David suggested to Kate. "It will be good experience for you." Kate would have liked for David to have gone with her, but she was too proud to say so. She would handle this without him. Besides, she had never been to America. She looked forward to the experience. The closing of the shipping line deal went smoothly. "While you're over there," David had told her, "you should see something of the country." Kate and Brad visited company subsidiaries in Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh and New York, and Kate was amazed by the size and energy of the United States. The highlight of Kate's trip was a visit to Dark Harbor, Maine, on an enchanting little island called Islesboro, in Penobscot Bay. She had been invited to dinner at the home of Charles Dana Gibson, the artist. There were 12 people at dinner and, except for Kate, they all had homes on the island. "This place has an interesting history," Gibson told Kate. "Years ago, residents used to get here by small coasting vessels from Boston. When the boat landed, they'd be met by a buggy and taken to their houses." "How many people live on this island?" Kate asked. "About 50 families. Did you see the lighthouse when the ferry docked?" "Yes. It's run by a lighthouse keeper and his dog. When a boat goes by, the dog goes out and rings the bell." Kate laughed. "You're joking." "No, ma'am. The funny thing is the dog is deaf as a stone. He puts his ear against the bell to feel if there's any vibration." Kate smiled. "It sounds as if you have a fascinating island here. It might be worth your while staying over and taking a look around in the morning." On an impulse, Kate said, "Why not?" She spent the night at the island's only hotel, the Islesboro Inn. In the morning she hired a horse and carriage, driven by one of the islanders. They left the center of Dark Harbor, which consisted of a general store, a hardware store and a small restaurant, and a few minutes later they were driving through a beautiful wooded area. Kate noticed that none of the little winding roads had names, nor were there any names on the mailboxes. She turned to her guide. "Don't people get lost here without any signs?" "Nope. The islanders know where everything is." Kate gave him a sidelong look. "I see." At the lower end of the island, they passed a burial ground. "Would you stop, please?" Kate asked. She stepped out of the carriage and walked over to the old cemetery and wandered around looking at the tombstones. Job Pendleton, died January 25, 1794, age 47. The epitaph read, "Beneath this stone, I rest my head in slumber sweet, Christ bless the bed." Jane, wife of Thomas Pendleton, died February 25, 1802, age 47. There were spirits here from another century, from an era long gone. Captain William Hatch drowned in Long Island Sound, October 1866, age 30 years. The epitaph on his stone read, "Storms all weathered and life's seas crossed." Kate stayed there a long time, enjoying the quiet and peace. Finally, she returned to the carriage and they drove on. "What is it like here in the winter?" Kate asked. "Cold. The bay used to freeze solid, and they'd come from the mainland by sleigh. Now, of course, we got the ferry." They rounded a curve, and there, next to the water below, was a beautiful white shingled, two-story house surrounded by delphinium, wild roses and poppies. The shutters on the 8 front windows were painted green, and next to the double doors were white benches and 6 pots of red geraniums. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. "Who owns that house?" "That's the old Drebin house. Mrs. Drebin died a few months back." "Who lives there now?" "Nobody, I reckon." "Do you know if it's for sale?" The guide looked at Kate and said, "If it is, it'll probably be bought by the son of one of the families already livin' here. The islanders don't take kindly to strangers." It was the wrong thing to say to Kate. 1 hour later, she was speaking to a lawyer for the estate. "It's about the Drebin house," Kate said. "Is it for sale?" The lawyer pursed his lips. "Well, yes, and no." "What does that mean?" "It's for sale, but a few people are already interested in buying it." The old families on the island, Kate thought. "Have they made an offer?" "Not yet, but I'm making one," Kate said. He said condescendingly, "That's an expensive house. Name your price." $50,000. "Let's go look at it." The inside of the house was even more enchanting than Kate had anticipated. The large, lovely hall faced the sea through a wall of glass. On one side of the hall was a large ballroom, and on the other side, a living room with fruitwood paneling stained by time and an enormous fireplace. There was a library, and a huge kitchen with an iron stove and a large pine worktable, and off of that was a butler's pantry and laundry room. Downstairs, the house had 6 bedrooms for the servants and 1 bathroom. Upstairs was a master bedroom suite and 4 smaller bedrooms. It was a much larger house than Kate had expected. But when David and I have our children, she thought, we'll need all these rooms. The grounds ran all the way down to the bay, where there was a private dock. Kate turned to the lawyer. "I'll take it." She decided to name it Cedar Hill House. She could not wait to get back to Klipdrift to break the news to David. On the way back to South Africa, Kate was filled with a wild excitement. The house in Dark Harbor was a sign, a symbol that she and David would be married. She knew he would love the house as much as she did. On the afternoon Kate and Brad arrived back in Klipdrift, Kate hurried to David's office. He was seated at his desk, working, and the sight of him set Kate's heart pounding. She had not realized how much she had missed him. David rose to his feet. "Kate, welcome home." And before she could speak, he said, "I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm getting married." 15. It had begun casually 6 weeks earlier. In the middle of a hectic day, David received a message that Tim O'Neill, the friend of an important American diamond buyer, was in Clipdrift and asking if David would be good enough to welcome him and perhaps take him to dinner. David had no time to waste on tourists, but he did not want to offend his customer. He would have asked Kate to entertain the visitor, but she was on a tour of the company's plants in North America with Brad Rogers. "I'm stuck," David decided. He called the hotel where O'Neill was staying and invited him to dinner that evening. "My daughter is with me," O'Neill told him. "I hope you don't mind if I bring her along." David was in no mood to spend the evening with a child. "Not at all," he said politely. He would make sure the evening was a short one. They met at the Grand Hotel, in the dining room. When David arrived, O'Neill and his daughter were already seated at the table. O'Neill was a handsome, gray-haired Irish-American in his early 50s. His daughter, Josephine, was the most beautiful woman David had ever seen. She was in her early 30s. With a stunning figure, soft blonde hair and clear blue eyes. The breath went out of David at the sight of her. I'm sorry I'm late," he said. "Some last-minute business." Josephine watched his reaction to her with amusement. "Sometimes that's the most exciting kind," she said innocently. "My father tells me you're a very important man, Mr. Blackwell." "Not really, and it's David." She nodded. "That's a good name. It suggests great strength." Before the dinner was over, David decided that Josephine O'Neill was much more than just a beautiful woman. She was intelligent, had a sense of humor and was skillful at making him feel at ease. David felt she was genuinely interested in him. She asked him questions about himself that no one had ever asked before. By the time the evening ended, he was already half in love with her. "Where's your home?" David asked Tim O'Neill. "San Francisco." "Will you be going back soon?" He made it sound as casual as he could. "Next week." Josephine smiled at David. "If Clipdrift is as interesting as it promises to be, I might persuade father to stay a little longer." "I intend to make it as interesting as possible," David assured her. "How would you like to go down into a diamond mine?" "We'd love it," Josephine answered. "Thank you." At one time David had personally escorted important visitors down into the mines, but he had long since delegated the task to subordinates. Now he heard himself saying, "Would tomorrow morning be convenient?" He had half a dozen meetings scheduled for the morning, but they suddenly seemed unimportant. He took the O'Neills down a rock shaft, 1,200 feet below ground. The shaft was 6 feet wide and 20 feet long, divided into 4 compartments, one for pumping, 2 for hoisting the blue diamondiferous earth and one with a double-decked cage to carry the miners to and from work. "I've always been curious about something," Josephine said. "Why are diamonds measured in carats?" "The carat was named for the carob seed," David explained, "because of its consistency and weight. 1 carat equals 200 milligrams, or 1/142nd of an ounce." Josephine said, "I'm absolutely fascinated, David." And he wondered if she was referring only to the diamonds. Her nearness was intoxicating. Every time he looked at Josephine, David felt a fresh sense of excitement. "You really should see something of the countryside," David told the O'Neills. "If you're free tomorrow, I'd be happy to take you around." Before her father could say anything, Josephine replied, "That would be lovely." David was with Josephine and her father every day after that, and each day David fell more deeply in love. He had never known anyone as bewitching. When David arrived to pick up the O'Neills for dinner one evening and Tim O'Neill said, "I'm a bit tired tonight, David. Would you mind if I didn't go along?" David tried to hide his pleasure. "No, sir. I understand." Josephine gave David a mischievous smile. "I'll try to keep you entertained," she promised. David took her to a restaurant in a hotel that had just opened. The room was crowded, but David was recognized and given a table immediately. A 3-piece ensemble was playing American music. David asked, "Would you like to dance?" "I'd love to." A moment later, Josephine was in his arms on the dance floor, and it was magic. David held her lovely body close to his, and he could feel her respond. "Josephine, I'm in love with you." She put a finger to his lips. "Please, David, don't." "Why?" "Because I couldn't marry you." "Do you love me?" She smiled up at him, her blue eyes sparkling. I'm crazy about you, my darling. Can't you tell? Then why? Because I could never live in Clipdrift. I'd go mad. You could give it a try. David, I'm tempted, but I know what would happen. If I married you and had to live here, I'd turn into a screaming shrew and we'd end up hating each other. I'd rather we said goodbye this way. I don't want to say goodbye. She looked up into his face, and David felt her body melt into his. David, is there any chance that you could live in San Francisco? It was an impossible idea. What would I do there? Let's have breakfast in the morning. I want you to talk to Father. Tim O'Neill said, Josephine has told me about your conversation last night. Looks like you two have a problem. But I might have a solution, if you're interested. I'm very interested, sir. O'Neill picked up a brown leather briefcase and removed some blueprints. Do you know anything about frozen foods? I'm afraid I don't. They first started freezing food in the United States in 1865. The problem was transporting it long distances without the food thawing out. We've got refrigerated railway cars, but no one's been able to come up with a way to refrigerate trucks. O'Neill tapped the blueprints. Until now, I just received a patent on it. This is going to revolutionize the entire food industry, David. David glanced at the blueprints. I'm afraid these don't mean much to me, Mr. O'Neill. That doesn't matter. I'm not looking for a technical expert. I have plenty of those. What I'm looking for is financing and someone to run the business. This isn't some wild pipe dream. I've talked to the top food processors in the business. This is going to be big, bigger than you can imagine. I need someone like you. The company headquarters will be in San Francisco, Josephine added. David sat there silent, digesting what he had just heard. You say you've been given a patent on this? That's right. I'm all set to move. Would you mind if I borrowed these blueprints and showed them to someone? I have no objection at all. The first thing David did was to check on Tim O'Neill. He learned that O'Neill had a solid reputation in San Francisco. He had been head of the science department at a Berkeley college there and was highly regarded. David knew nothing about the freezing of food, but he intended to find out. I'll be back in 5 days, darling. I want you and your father to wait for me. As long as you like. I'll miss you, Josephine said. I'll miss you, too. And he meant it more than she knew. David took the train to Johannesburg and made an appointment to see Edward Broderick, the owner of the largest meatpacking plant in South Africa. I want your opinion on something. David handed him the blueprints. I need to know if this can work. I don't know a damn thing about frozen foods or trucks, but I know people who do. If you come back this afternoon, I'll leave a couple of experts here for you, David. At 4 o'clock that afternoon David returned to the packing plant. He found that he was nervous, in a state of uncertainty, because he was not sure how he wanted the meeting to go. 2 weeks earlier, he would have laughed if anyone had even suggested he would ever leave Kruger Brent, Limited. It was a part of him. He would have laughed even harder if they had told him he would have considered heading a little food company in San Francisco. It was insane, except for one thing, Josephine O'Neill. There were 2 men in the room with Edward Broderick. This is Dr. Crawford and Mr. Kaufman. David Blackwell. They exchanged greetings. David asked, have you gentlemen had a chance to look at the blueprints? Dr. Crawford replied, we certainly have, Mr. Blackwell. We've been over them thoroughly. David took a deep breath. And I understand that the United States Patent Office has granted a patent on this. That's right. Well, Mr. Blackwell, whoever got that patent is going to be one very rich man. David nodded slowly, filled with conflicting emotions. It's like all great inventions, it's so simple you wonder why someone didn't think of it sooner. This one can't miss. David did not know how to react. He had half hoped that the decision would be taken out of his hands. If Tim O'Neill's invention was useless, there was a chance of persuading Josephine to stay in South Africa. But what O'Neill had told him was true. It did work. Now David had to make his decision. He thought of nothing else on the journey back to Clipdrift. If he accepted, it would mean leaving the company, starting up a new, untried business. He was an American, but America was a foreign country to him. He held an important position in one of the most powerful companies in the world. He loved his job. Jamie and Margaret McGregor had been very good to him. And then there was Kate. He had cared for her since she was a baby. He had watched her grow up from a stubborn, dirty-faced tomboy to a lovely young woman. Her life was a photo album in his mind. He turned the pages and there was Kate at 4, 8, 10, 14, 21, vulnerable, unpredictable. By the time the train arrived at Clipdrift, David had made up his mind. He was not going to leave Kruger Brent, Limited. He drove directly to the Grand Hotel and went up to the O'Neill suite. Josephine opened the door for him. David. He took her in his arms and kissed her hungrily, feeling her warm body pressing against his. "Oh, David, I've missed you so much. I don't ever want to be away from you again." "You won't have to," David said slowly. "I'm going to San Francisco." David had waited with growing anxiety for Kate to return from the United States. Now that he had made his decision, he was eager to get started on his new life, impatient to marry Josephine. And now Kate was back, and he was standing in front of her saying, "I'm getting married." Kate heard the words through a roaring in her ears. She felt suddenly faint, and she gripped the edge of the desk for support. "I want to die," she thought. "Please let me die." Somehow, from some deep wellspring of will, she managed a smile. "Tell me about her, David." She was proud of how calm her voice sounded. "Who is she?" "Her name is Josephine O'Neill. She's been visiting here with her father. I know you two will be good friends, Kate. She's a fine woman." "She must be, if you love her, David." He hesitated. "There's one more thing, Kate. I'm going to be leaving the company." The world was falling in on her. "Just because you're getting married, doesn't mean you have to." "It isn't that. Josephine's father is starting a new business in San Francisco. They need me." So you'll be living in San Francisco?" "Yes. Brad Rogers can handle my job easily, and we'll pick a lot management team too." "Back him up." "Kate, I can't tell you what a difficult decision this was for me." "Of course, David. You must love her very much. When do I get to meet the bride?" David smiled, pleased at how well Kate was taking the news. "Tonight, if you're free for dinner." "Yes, I'm free." She would not let the tears come until she was alone. The four of them had dinner at the McGregor mansion. The moment Kate saw Josephine, she blanched. Oh God. No wonder he's in love with her. She was dazzling. Just being in her presence made Kate feel awkward and ugly. And to make matters worse, Josephine was gracious and charming. And obviously very much in love with David. Bloody hell. During dinner Tim O'Neill told Kate about the new company. "It sounds very interesting," Kate said. "I'm afraid it's no Kruger Brent, Limited, Miss McGregor. We'll have to start small, but with David running it, we'll do all." "Right. With David running it, you can't miss," Kate assured him. The evening was an agony. In the same cataclysmic moment, she had lost the man she loved and the one person who was indispensable to Kruger Brent, Limited. She carried on a conversation and managed to get through the evening, but afterward she had no recollection of what she said or did. She only knew that every time David and Josephine looked at each other or touched, she wanted to kill herself. On the way back to the hotel, Josephine said, "She's in love with you, David." He smiled. "Kate, no. We're friends. We have been since she was a baby. She liked you a lot." Josephine smiled. Men are so naive. In David's office the following morning, Tim O'Neill and David sat facing each other. "I'll need about 2 months to get my affairs in order here," David said. "I've been thinking about the financing we'll need to begin with. If we go to one of the big companies, they'll swallow us up and give us a small share. It won't belong to us anymore. I think we should finance it ourselves. I figure it will cost $80,000 to get started. I've saved the equivalent of about $40,000. We'll need $40,000 more." "I have $10,000, Tim O'Neill said. "And I have a brother who will loan me another $5,000. "So, we're $25,000 short," David said. "We'll try to borrow that from a bank." "We'll leave for San Francisco right away," O'Neill told David, "and get everything set up for you." Josephine and her father left for the United States 2 days later. "Send them to Cape Town in the private railway car, David," Kate offered. "That's very generous of you, Kate." The morning Josephine left, David felt as though a piece of his life had been taken away. He could not wait to join her in San Francisco. The next few weeks were taken up with a search for a management team to back up Brad Rogers. A list of possible candidates was carefully drawn up, and Kate and David and Brad spent hours discussing each one. Taylor is a good technician, but he's weak on management. What about Simmons? He's good, but he's not ready yet, Brad decided. Give him another 5 years. Babcock. Not a bad choice. Let's discuss him. What about Peterson? Not enough of a company man, David said. He's too concerned with himself. And even as he said it, he felt a pang of guilt because he was deserting Kate. They continued on with the list of names. By the end of the month, they had narrowed the choice to 4 men to work with Brad Rogers. All of them were working abroad, and they were sent for so that they could be interviewed. The first 2 interviews went well. I'd be satisfied with either one of them, Kate assured David and Brad. On the morning the 3rd interview was to take place, David walked into Kate's office, his face pale. Is my job still open? Kate looked at Biss' expression and stood up in alarm. What is it, David? He sank into a chair. Something has happened. Kate was out from behind the desk and by his side in an instant. Tell me. I just got a letter from Tim O'Neill. He's sold the business. What do you mean? Exactly what I said. He accepted an offer of $200,000 and a royalty for his patent from the 3-star meat packing company in Chicago. David's voice was filled with bitterness. The company would like to hire me to manage it for them. He regrets any inconvenience to me, but he couldn't turn down that kind of money. Kate looked at him intently. And Josephine, what does she say? She must be furious with her father. There was a letter from her, too. We'll marry as soon as I come to San Francisco. And you're not going. Of course I'm not going. David exploded. Before, I had something to offer. I could have built it into a great company. But they were in too much a damned hurry for the money. David, you're not being fair when you say they. Just be. O'Neill would never have made that deal without Josephine's approval. I don't know what to say, David. There is nothing to say. Except that I almost made the biggest mistake of my life. Kate walked over to the desk and picked up the list of candidates. Slowly, she began to tear it up. In the weeks that followed, David plunged himself deeply into his work, trying to forget his bitterness and hurt. He received several letters from Josephine O'Neill, and he threw them all away, unread. But he could not get her out of his mind. Kate, deeply aware of David's pain, let him know she was there if he needed her. 6 months had passed since David received the letter from Tim O'Neill. During that time, Kate and David continued to work closely together, travel together and be alone together much of the time. Kate tried to please him in every way she could. She dressed for him, planned things he would enjoy and went out of her way to make his life as happy as possible. As far as she could tell, it was having no effect at all. And finally she lost her patience. She and David were in Rio de Janeiro, checking on a new mineral find. They had had dinner at their hotel and were in Kate's room going over some figures late at night. Kate had changed to a comfortable kimono and slippers. When they finished, David stretched and said, "Well, that's it for tonight. I guess I'll go on to bed." Kate said quietly, "Isn't it time you came out of mourning, David?" He looked at her in surprise. "Mourning? For Josephine O'Neill? She's out of my life. Then act like it." "Just what would you like me to do, Kate?" he asked curtly. Kate was angry now. Angry at David's blindness, angry about all the wasted time. "I'll tell you what I'd like you to do, kiss me." "What? Bloody hell, David. I'm your boss, damn it." She moved close to him. "Kiss me." And she pressed her ups against his and put her arms around him. She felt him resist and start to draw back. And then slowly his arms circled her body, and he kissed her. "Kate," she whispered against Biss' lips. "I thought you'd never ask." They were married 6 weeks later. It was the biggest wedding Klipdrift had ever seen or would see again. It was held in the town's largest church and afterward there was a reception in the town hall and everyone was invited. There were mountains of food and uncounted cases of beer and whiskey and champagne, and musicians played and the festivities lasted until dawn. When the sun came up, Kate and David slipped away. "I'll go home and finish packing," Kate said. Pick me up in an hour." In the pale dawn light, Kate entered the huge house alone and went upstairs to her bedroom. She walked over to a painting on the wall and pressed against the frame. The painting flew back, revealing a wall safe. She opened it and brought out a contract. It was for the purchase of the 3-Star Meat Packing Company of Chicago by Kate McGregor. Next to it was a contract from the 3-Star Meat Packing Company purchasing the rights to Tim O'Neill's freezing process for $200,000. Kate hesitated a moment.